My biggest fear would be when the first comes and I don't get the rent.
I found that my tenant had dumped concrete down my toilet. Can you believe Fair Housing fined me $5,000 for that?
How do you onboard your tenants? What do you do?
I don't even know if I do it right.
If you're a landlord, don't just rent, rent perfect. The Rent Perfect podcast with property expert and private investigator, David Pickron.
Well, hello and welcome to another episode of the Rent Perfect podcast. We're grateful you're here. You know, it's interesting today because I'm bringing back Jake Beeson from Beehive Property Management because I've had so many comments and so many people saying, I learned so much from that first podcast that I really would love to hear more about his style and what he does. And so since that was so valuable, I'm going to challenge you guys, get out a piece of paper, take some notes. This is really good stuff. And what we're going to talk about today is, do I really need a property manager? And, you know, it's not yes and it's not no. It just all depends your situation. So I want to welcome back Jake Beeson. Thanks for coming back and joining us again, Jake.
Hey, thanks. This is great. As you know, I can talk about this stuff all day long.
And we love hearing what you have to say because what you have to say is so important to our audience. And so, you know, oftentimes I only know what I know. And so when people come to me and they say, hey, do I need a property manager? You know, if you knew what I knew and you're willing to take the time, then maybe the answer is no, you can do it yourself with all the tools that Rent Perfect offers.
Yep.
But if you have a certain personality type or you don't have the time, I would rather see you do it right with a property manager than do it wrong without a property manager.
Agreed.
Right? And so today I really want to talk about, for those who maybe have inherited a property or are new in the business or maybe just fed up or maybe had that experience that they got a bad renter in there that put them through a really bad experience. I want to really, really put it in someone's mind whether their answer is yes or no. So thanks again for coming. And Jake, just in case no one saw that first episode that you were on, give us an idea tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, great. It's great to be here. I'm actually trained as an accountant, strangely enough. And when I was in accounting school, one of our teachers said, you know, they've done some studies to find out what makes a good accountant. And the answer was interesting. It was tolerance for ambiguity, which we don't typically think that accountants have a tolerance for ambiguity, meaning tolerance for things not being exact.
Right.
And so I worked in the accounting business for a while. I worked in the tax business. I prepared tax returns, and it just wasn't my personality. I couldn't sit in a cubicle all day. And while it's fascinating and interesting to me, it just wasn't my style. So trained as an accountant, been kind of on the edges of the real estate business for a while. I've had a license for almost 20 years now, an Arizona real estate license. And so I've done transactions and different things, but the property management business sort of suits me. And one of the reasons is because I see something different every day.
Yeah, it's just a fun industry to be in. I agree. Yeah. Every day is a different day, and some good and some bad, and some just average days. Right?
Well, and sometimes people say, boy, you must see a lot of stuff. And it seems like almost on a monthly basis, it's, boy, I have not seen that before.
It's true.
But
so
that
true.
But that makes it fun because you see different things every day. And in the property management game, obviously, there's several aspects to it. We do collect rent. That's a big part of what we do. We do screen tenants. That's a big part of what we do. We manage maintenance. It's a lot of work. And so there are several facets to the business and a lot of moving parts. As an individual investor, you're responsible for all those things. You don't have a team and systems and processes necessarily like I do at my company, but you still can do it. But there's a few things I tell my clients about property managers, and I'm going to put the question in your mouth. If your question, David, is, do I need a property manager? Well, Dave, tell me, who do you think needs a property manager?
Well, I imagine that somebody who doesn't have the time, the knowledge to do this business correctly. I mean, I see a lot of our clients, they inherit a property. They think, oh, it's just finding somebody. I'll go to Zillow and I'll put an ad on Zillow.
Or there's already a renter in it.
Right. Or there's already a renter in it and they think it's easy. And it can be easy if you do it right. But, you know, I imagine most of the time people are calling you is because it didn't go that well.
Right.
So what's your average phone call coming in with somebody who says, hey, I'm self-managed. I'm thinking about getting a property manager. How do you handle that phone call?
Well, and it's very similar to that. People will call and say, my name's Joe. I have a property at 123 Elm Street, and I need a property manager. And what I do is I start asking questions. And I try to be careful and professional in how I present it, but I say, well, that's great. Who's managing the property now? And often it's, well, I've been managing it myself, or I have another management company that's working on it. But for the folks that are managing it themselves, that presents other questions. Because they're managing it for themselves now, I say, well, how's that going? And oftentimes there'll be issues or problems, and so they're ready to throw their hands up and say, Jake, I'm done. I do not want to manage this anymore. However, if they've been managing it, and so I ask them, I say, well, how's it been going? Are you okay managing it? Do you like managing it? Yeah, Jake, it was fine until the tenant did this, this, and this.
Right.
Okay, well, has the tenant done that a lot? No, it's never happened before, just this one time. And so my first inclination is not to chase away business, but to tell that person, hey, Joe, how about if I can help you fix this little problem or big problem? Joe thinks it's a big problem. I don't want to minimize it, say it's a little problem. Joe, how about if I help you fix this problem at no cost or obligation? Would you be willing to continue managing this yourself and let me hold your hand a little bit from time to time? And in many cases, they like that because I don't want to manage a property for somebody who can do it themselves. I'm okay with that. Statistically, 90% or more of properties, single family, are managed by the owners. The property management game only has about a 10% market share out there. So guess what? 90% of homes are managed by people who are out there doing it. They're doing a good job at it. Well, let's say they're doing a medium job at it, because a lot of these, by the time they come to me, there's some other things going on. But I ask people 3 questions when they say, do they need a manager? This is just me, and I have never written this down anywhere, but these are the questions I ask. Number 1, are you willing to screen people appropriately? What that means is you're going to ask them some uncomfortable questions. A guy named David comes and wants to rent my house. I say, okay, David, how many people are going to live in the property? That's just a number. What pets do you have? Well, I have a fish, a bird, a cat, and a snake. But you have to be willing to ask that.
Right.
So will you screen people effectively? If you're willing to do that, on to question number 2. Are you willing to collect your rent? Well, what does that mean? Well, when you write this lease and you tell people the rent's due on the 2nd, does the 2nd mean the 2nd? Or are you going to say, well, it's the 13th, I'm fine. Just, yeah, he's got other stuff going on he can't pay. Right. And number 3, when the rent doesn't come in or when the tenant violates the lease or breaches the lease, are you willing to do anything about it? And it doesn't mean you get to go take the front door off and take the back door off. You don't get to go into their house and throw all their stuff on the lawn. You don't get to shut the utilities off. All of those things are illegal and you should not do them. But are you willing to reach out for help? Hey, Mr. Attorney. Hey, Mr. Property Manager. Hey, Mr. Guy at my church who happens to know about property management. Will you help me to give this tenant a notice that says, dear Mr. Tenant, you have 5 days to pay your rent. That's Arizona rules. But if you're willing to screen and collect your money and hold your tenants accountable, you're a great property manager. You'll be fine. You don't need me. If any of those things make you nervous or you start sweating when you think about them, you should call me and we should talk.
Right, because you can get in so much trouble if you don't screen the right way. I mean, let's be honest. You can get lucky, and you can move someone in that gives you no problems.
Agreed.
And you think you're the best property manager in the world, right? Oh, yeah, no problem. Rent, lived there for 4 years. It's beautiful. You made a ton of mistakes, but you got away with it. But eventually, you're going to find a person that really takes you through the ringer, right? So if you think you're all that great and you don't do these things, and you get away with it, you're lucky.
And good
right?
for you. I've had people call us and say, well, I've had the first tenant in there for 7 years. And I think, man, you don't need me. I need you. How did you find a tenant who is willing to stay for 7 years and pay? But, we can agree that's an anomaly.
Right. Number 2, like you said, if you're not willing to get the rent when the rent's due, because if it's not due on the 2nd and you take it on the 5th this month and you're okay with that, when are you getting rent the next month, right? It's not coming on the 2nd. It's coming on the 5th, if not the 7th. And if you're okay with the 7th, when is it coming next month? Because a lot of people out there, and I'm not saying everybody, but a lot of people live paycheck to paycheck. And they're waiting for that Friday paycheck to come in, whether it lands on the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, to pay their rent. And eventually that relationship most likely will end in an eviction because you're just going to let them get further. And you're actually doing them a disservice by letting them get further and further behind until there's a point of no return, right?
And think about the psychology of it. And this is not dollars and cents, although I'm an accountant. I like talking dollars and cents. This is not dollars and cents, but look at what's going on at your house. And I know, David, you have your own rentals. Look what's going on in your house. If the rent stretches to the 10th, you're blaming your wife for not collecting it. She's blaming you for not collecting it. Now all of a sudden you've got discord in your home over this investment.
Because it got mortgages due.
Because there's a mortgage due, should be paid on the 1st, late the 15th. Now there's a late fee on the mortgage. Well, is the tenant going to pay the late fee? Well, honey, you're the one that wrote the lease and didn't put any late fees in there. This conversation happens a lot because I've been a witness and a party to those conversations where a husband and wife sit in my office and have disagreements over whose job it was to manage the rental. And believe me, they're there to hire me to manage it because they just can't have it. But you can't be willing to let this investment cause disharmony and cause lack of, hurt the harmony of your home.
Right.
You shouldn't do that. And so there are rules in place for that very reason. But also, if the tenant pays in the 5th this month and it's okay, and they pay the 7th the next month, then the 10th and the 15th, well, pretty soon you're into the 30th, and then you got the slingshot coming of the rent the next month. And I've had people call me, and I reach out to people who manage their own homes as much as I can. I have a kind of a circle of friends. I have 5 or 6 of them, and I have them on a list, and I know that they manage their own homes. And I'm not trying to sell them my services, but I do know that they're out there, and I want them to call me if they need help, which I don't mind doing. But like I had somebody call and say, hey, Jake, I need your help. My tenant paid late. Okay. When did they pay? Well, they didn't pay last month. Okay, well, let's say it's the 15th now. Okay, so they didn't pay last month's rent. Oh, wait, they did pay, but that check bounced. Okay, so what about the month before? No, they didn't pay that month either. Okay, let's back up now.
Or partial.
Yeah,
right.
And at this point, I'm looking at it going, okay, so in the past 2.5 months, you've received 1/2 month's rent. Well, man, Jake, when you say it like that, you make it sound bad. Right. Well, this is a big deal. Let's get started. Let's reach out to the tenant. Let's find out what's going on. I had a client of ours. She happened to be in California, and she had a rental here in Phoenix. And she called and said, hey, I'm having trouble. I cannot get a hold of this tenant. She won't call me back. She's not paying the rent. I'm worried about the house. It'd been like 3 months. It was a big deal. Now, I don't know why the client didn't fly out to Arizona and knock on the door, but, limited resources, it's a lot of work. I said, well, what phone numbers do you have for her? She said, well, all I have is her home and her work number. I said, have you called her work number? She said, no, why would I call her work number? I said, has she instructed you specifically not to call her work number? No, she said, I can call her wherever. Well, I called her work number. 20 minutes later, the tenant called the owner and said, who's this guy named Jake calling my work? Well, we need to collect the rent. Lady paid all the rent. So it's not that you can't do it. It's that sometimes maybe you just need a little helping hand, but you have to be willing to collect your rent. Back to your point number 2, you have to be willing to get that money and professionally let the tenant know, hey, this is a business and we're running and I have obligations and you have obligations, but you have to get your money in the door and have to be willing to get the money in the door.
And it takes a certain personality to go get that rent.
Agreed. And I'm not saying I'm the best at it, but it does take a certain personality.
Because the way that my wife and I run our properties is she usually manages the day-to-day, but when she needs the enforcer to come in, the phone call to the employer, the where's the rent, it's me. Because I have more of that personality. You could not get my wife to make that phone call. She does not like any contention at all. And I actually say, honey, without me, you're a terrible property manager, right? Love her to death.
Without you, should have to hire me.
Yeah, love her to death, and she does so many great things, but it does take a certain personality. And in some of our clients, if you don't have that personality, go find somebody, a property management company that can do that. So that's a great point.
So the third thing we talked about is being willing to enforce your lease. And I don't mean to say this, I don't mean to present that it's harsh or being hard with people, but you do have a 7 or 8 page lease document that governs the relationship you have with your tenant. And you have to be willing to have that document mean something. And I've had conversations with clients and with tenants and said, hey, at some point the lease agreement we have has to mean something, because that's what the courts will look at if we go that far. That's the thing we agreed to. We both signed on the dotted line. We didn't spit in our hands and shake, because the truth is...
Some of my clients do that. Well, we're trying to get them not to.
And some lawyers will say that's a valid contract. But this is where it gets a little bit more difficult for a landlord that maybe doesn't have a manager. Is they don't know what to do. Jake, the guy hasn't paid in 2 weeks. What do I do? I've called, I've texted, I've emailed, I've taken his kids' Happy Meals. True story. I've done everything I can to be nice to him, but man, he just won't pay the money. Well, at that point, you may have to get legal involved or start taking legal action, which is scary. And I understand it's scary. What I suggest people do is talk to people that you know. Talk to people at your kid's school. Talk to people at your church. Talk to your neighbors. Hey, David, do you have any rental houses? Yeah, I do. Whoa, wait, you do? I had no idea. Yeah, well, what do you do when people pay late? Oh, well, I do A, B, and C. Ask around to the people that you know and trust. Hey, do you know anybody that's got any rentals? Yeah, the guy that lives in the corner, he's got a couple.
Right.
Go knock on his door. Guess what? He will love to share with you his experiences. And so the first thing you have to do is find the resources in your community and just ask around. Say, hey, I'm really having struggles with a tenant. What can I do? Your next step may be to call a property manager, or one of those people may have a manager. And I'm thrilled if I get that call because I truly only want to help. I'm not going to say, hey, sign up with me first and then I'll help. What I want is to people to have a good experience with it.
Right.
And so you have to reach out to those resources, but you have to be willing to not let the tenant slide. When it's the 15th of the month, the rent was due the 2nd, you have to do something. You have to take action. And if you're unwilling to do that, or it makes you uncomfortable, you start sweating thinking about it, or you're going to fight with your spouse or your significant other about it, man, call a property manager, because you may not be cut out for this game, which is okay. It's not for everybody. But professional property managers, it's all we do, and most of us are good at it. And I'm not going to say it doesn't bother me to give people legal notices because I don't love it, but it does work.
Well, one of the phone calls, Jake, that I get when I put a property out, on Zillow or on the internet, or even put a sign in my front yard, is one of the questions I get when I take the phone call is, are you a professional property management company? And I always wonder, why are you asking me that question, right? That's a big red flag to me, saying, what do you see that a professional property management company does that you feel a private owner doesn't do? And I really think the answer is, you guys as property management companies are crossing your T's and you're dotting your I's, and you're laying out everything right from the beginning of what you're going to put up with and what you're not going to put up with. And when I turn around and I show my properties to people, I, am friendly, but I also am all business. And I let them know, listen, I'm a private investigator, and if you're not honest on your application, I'm easily going to find that out. It's really easy for me. Right? Well, you can tell people you're a PI if you want as a property investigator. I don't care.
Right.
But you're going to let people know, listen, I have the resources that's going to give me the truth. So make sure you fill out your application in a very thorough way.
Yep.
And number two is, I have the resources to evict you right away. And some people would say, well, geez, why would you take that approach on a new relationship? Well, what I'm really doing is I'm just setting the parameters of our relationship, right? So when the second comes or the third comes and you do get a notice, you can't say, well, Dave, why did you give me a notice? I told you up front.
I always pay my rent.
Right. Right. That's what they tell
Except
me.
for the first month renting from you.
Exactly. So I back up the lease by telling them verbally, listen, I have the resources to do this. And so make sure you pay the rent because I want a great relationship with you. And for those who, aren't going to be offended by that, are the people who probably are never late on the rent. Yeah, don't worry about that, Dave. We're not going to have that problem. The people who say, well, geez, that was kind of rude, those might be the people that are going to be asking me for some leeway into the future. And so I think we solve a lot of our problems by addressing them right at the beginning, right at that first interview. We talked weeks ago in their other podcast about, screening, the pre-screening and the conversation. That might be the time to do that because it sets it up for if that situation comes later, it's not a surprise.
Agreed.
I manage this thing in a certain way. I don't give a lot of leeway. And I actually feel like, as a good landlord, I'm doing you a favor by sticking to the rules. Because the minute I don't and I muddy the relationship, you and I are both going to have problems. And it might end up in a judgment on your credit, maybe a garnishment at your work. And you don't want that, and I don't want that for you either.
No, it's too much trouble. And the reason some folks don't like to use or don't like to rent from a professional property management company, I'll be honest with you, because there's a lot of property managers, people in my business who are knuckleheads that don't do it right, that do a poor job. And it's possible that tenant has had a bad experience with ABC Property Management down the street, and they said, man, I will never, ever rent another property from a property management company, which I get because they're, like lots of industries, there's knuckleheads in the property management game. I get it. We took over some properties the other day from a gentleman who said, hey, I'm having struggles with my property manager. Kind of looked at the property and got a feel for it, talked to the tenants. And if I talked to one or two tenants, it's no big deal. I talked to 3 different tenants that said the same thing about, hey, this is what happens when I try to do stuff with the property manager. They're just not as responsive as they could be, and I can't seem to get my rent over to them because their office is closed, these kind of things. So there are some bad property managers out there. also, though, you'll have a tenant who maybe can't pass a regular screening background check. Maybe they have a little bit of criminal history. Maybe they have some credit struggles, and they don't want to go through a property manager because they know the property manager is going to check. And the reason is I have a contract with the owner of the house, and that contract specifies that I will do a certain job, which is to 50 state credit criminal background check, which is to verify employment, verify rental history with their prior landlord. I have steps I have to follow. And while that may be a little more impersonal, they are steps I have to follow. And some tenants are like, yeah, I don't want to go through that trouble. Or like I said, they have a criminal background, they have credit struggles, and they think that a self-managed landlord will not check. And as you know, David, it's scary, but many people don't.
I agree. That's what this whole podcast is about. Is one of the things that we want you to Rent Perfect is if you're not going to use a property management company and self-manage, you got to do those things that a property management company would do. You almost have to make a contract with yourself and say, this is my procedure, this is my policy, and I'm not going to deviate.
Well said, and that's hard for us. It's hard for us to set goals to lose weight or to read more or to eat less. It's hard for us to make goals like that. But you're right. If you can make a contract with yourself and write it down and say, hey, I am going to screen properly. Right. I'm going to collect my rent, and I'm going to take action if there's a breach of the lease, maybe specifically with respect to rent, but I'm going to take action with a breach of the lease. If you're not willing to do those three things, I just can't think of how you get around those three things in managing your own property. Right. If you're willing to do those three things, you'll be fine. And call me and say, hey, Jake, I've done these things and it's working great. Good for you.
Well, the Rent Perfect whole philosophy is success. We talk a lot about how you'll get in a lot of trouble. We tell some stories. We've seen it, you and I, in our career. But we really want success. We want our people to have success. So whether it's using a property manager or it's doing it yourself, we don't care how you get there.
I agree.
Right? We just want to make sure that the statistics, say that 3 times, right? The statistics are on your side, that you'll have a successful, experience, because ultimately we talk about 3 things here. We want to make more money. We want to have more time to do the things we want to do. We want to have less headaches, right, and less stress in our lives. And so one last question I want to leave with this podcast is, what can a landlord expect to pay a property manager? I know this is a nationwide show. We're here in Arizona, but is there an average around the nation that if they're thinking about, well, do I want to pay the property manager to do? What are you guys charging?
Well, it's a great question. As you said, it's a big country, and the numbers are all over the board. Okay. I've seen prices as low as 6%. Now that's if, let's say in my situation, I'm a property management company. I've managed 100 properties for a big, I don't know if it was a REIT, just a big company.
One entity.
One entity. One company owned a ton of houses, and those prices are going to be lower. A regular guy walks off the street, just, maybe has one house they want to turn over to us. That one may go as high as 10% of the gross rents. So I would say don't plan to pay less than, let's call it 8. Okay. But you probably shouldn't pay more than 10% of the gross rents. Now, if you're in Hawaii or if you're in California or New York City or Los Angeles where the rent rates are really high, it may be that those rates are lower. Okay. But like I said, I'm an accountant. I understand the analysis side of it. If it were me and I was being conservative and plugging in my thing, I would plug in $100 a month. Okay. And that's a good conservative number to be safe with your investments. You plug in $50 a month, it's going to mess up your model. You're not going to realize that.
And then I think that if you do decide to use a property management company, Rent Perfect doesn't say use it or don't use it. We want you to just find success. But if you do it, a lot of times property management companies will get your rent to that market level, and you'll end up making the same amount of money, because a lot of self-managed people will start at, let's just throw out a figure, say $1,200 a month for my place. Right. And year after year go by and we keep it at $1,200 just because people are taking care of the property. We're getting our rent, and soon market value is $1,500, $1,600. Well, the nice thing about a property management company is they can keep you up to date with your property value. And by paying them that 8%, on average, you actually probably can make the same amount of money, if not more, if you decide to go that direction. We're not promoting that. We're not saying that. But I actually think price should not be an issue when you're thinking about whether you should have a property management company, it should go back to those questions that we asked, and that is, am I willing, to get the rent on time, screen my tenants, and, go ahead and hold them to the lease, and send them notices and maybe have an uncomfortable situation. So I want our Rent Perfect Nation to think about why you should hire a property management company, and I think pricing should not even be an issue. It's you can lose way more money not doing those three things correctly than you can worried about 8%.
Well, and I've had people call me and say, "Well, Jake," I say, "Well, how much do you want to rent the house for?" Well, it needs to rent for the mortgage payment plus the management fee. Well, that would be excellent if that were how the world works. Is I could say, well, here's my mortgage payment, here's the management fee, that's the rent. In many cases, it's not. And so while the numbers do figure into it, you got to ask yourself a few questions about it. What's my time worth? Well, think about your job. Where do you work? If you have to spend 3 hours a month at work, how long does it take you? Is that money tax deductible? It's not. My fee is tax deductible. It's an expense against the property. But what's your time worth? What's your peace of mind worth? Meaning if you're fighting with your significant other every month about whose job it is to collect the rent, or whose job it was to call the plumber, or whose job it was to tell the tenant they couldn't have a dog, that has some value. It's putting wear and tear on your relationships. It's putting wear and tear on your life. So plug that into that number. But yeah, if it's just a dollar amount, you may not be ready to hire a property manager, because what we also don't want is someone to hire us and then resent that they hired us. We are not a necessary evil. You do not have to hire us. You can do it yourself. But if you do, think of it as an investment in your property, and hey, I've got a professional handling this who has a ton of experience, but you don't need them. We have clients that, we have houses we manage for 4 or 5 years, and they say, hey, I'm going to make a go at this on my own. Great. Any resources we have, you're welcome to. Do you have a lease? Great. Here's our lease. Use this one. Do you have an application? No? Great. Here's our lease. Here's our application. Use this one. This is who we've been using for screening. We happen to use Rent Perfect for screening. Here's how you can go directly to them and not through our system. And so, yeah, there are dollars and cents involved, but it's a bigger issue of what am I really getting for that money?
Well, Jake, we have a ton of property managers as clients, and they're all fantastic. I really shouldn't say I feel like our clients are fantastic, because I know they're doing things the right way, and I intimately know most of them. But if you were to give our listeners just a small amount of advice on how in their local area, how should they interview property management companies? What should they look for? Let's close with that, because we really want, if they're listening to this right now and they're thinking, maybe I don't want to do everything that I should do, but I also, don't want to find a property manager who's not going to do their job, or, you help people. I love that about you. Whether you use me or not, I'm going to help you. How can people find that in their local area?
Well, there's a list of questions that floats around on the internet, like 20 questions you should ask your property manager. And I know it's out there because I've seen it, and I've been interviewed by prospective clients who maybe don't know that I know. And so I have answers to all of those questions because I work in the business. But you need to, for me, it's a personality thing. You have to feel like you're comfortable with them and that they're going to do what you need to do. And I think, number one, you key on those 3 things. What are your procedures for screening? Just ask them straight up, what are your screening procedures? They should be willing to answer that, and they should be proud of their procedures. Hey, this is how we do it. What are your procedures? The tenant doesn't pay. What happens? And I've had people ask me that. Hey, Jake, I know tenants don't pay all the time. Tenant doesn't pay. What happens? And I walk them through our process. Okay, if a tenant doesn't pay, and our process happens to be, we have a computer-generated list through our software system that says, here's all the people that haven't paid by this date, and then we have a set of procedures we go through to collect money. And the third one is, well, what do you do if the tenant breaks the lease? What do you do if the tenant moves in their girlfriend who isn't on the lease? What do you do if the tenant moves in a dog? What do you do if the tenant bumps their car into the garage door? How do you handle stuff that's stressful that I, the landlord, do not want to monkey with? What are you going to do as a manager? And listen to those answers. And you're going to find out whether you jive with that person's personality or not right away. But also, as I mentioned before, talk to your friends, talk to family members, talk to people at your kid's school, talk to people at your church if you have one. Hey, David, who are you using to manage your properties? Do you like them? Do you not like them? Hey, Susie, who are you using to manage your properties? Do you like them? Do you not like them? And interview your friends, because you know your friends and you know how they think. What things do you not like about your manager, Susie? Well, I hate that I can't get an email back from them. Right. And so for me, that's a good way to go about it.
So I think one thing you said, and let's close with this, guys, it's all about relationships. I mean, the reality is you got to really feel comfortable with the people that are going to manage your property. And if you're going to pay someone to do it, so I would always invite them to lunch. I'd invite them into a face-to-face setting. If they won't take a lunch with you, then they're not going to return that email. They're not going to return that phone call. And so face-to-face, ask those questions at lunch and see if you really jive with someone. There's a lot of things that come up that you're going to need to just maybe make a phone call, late at night and say, hey, I have this question or this is happening, and you got to make sure that your property manager has your back. Jake, thank you so much. We appreciate you back. You did come back because so many people just love what you said, and I really appreciate you taking your time. I know it's valuable. And until next time, we want you just to rent perfect.